in the glittering heart of London. Billionaire Charles Whitmore toasted his perfect legacy, a glass of vintage crystal catching the light of 1,000 chandeliers. He spoke of bloodlines and empires, oblivious to the girl in the shadows, a waitress with trembling hands and a secret that could dismantle his world. Elena was the daughter he discarded, the ghost of a past he buried. Now she was holding the tray, and his fate for 25 years. Elena was a ghost in the system, a name on a dusty folder in a foster home. But a single drop of blood revealed a truth, more intoxicating and more dangerous than any lie. The air inside the Grosvenor House ballroom was heavy, a suffocating blend of expensive oud, the metallic temps of chilled champagne, and the silent, invisible weight of absolute power. Thousands of crystals hung from the ceiling, shivering slightly as the heavy bass of a string quartet hummed through the floorboards. To the elite gathered here, it was just another Tuesday, a routine display of opulence and influence. To Elena, it was the epicenter of a storm she had been tracking for a lifetime. She felt the rough polyester of her server's vest scratching against the nape of her neck, a stark, irritating contrast to the silk and velvet swirling around her. Her fingers, calloused from years of working 3 jobs to put herself through a degree she could barely afford, gripped the silver tray with a white-knuckled intensity. She wasn't just a waitress tonight. She was an observer, a silent witness to the man who shared half her DNA, but none of her struggles. Charles Whitmore stood at the center of the room, a titan of industry whose name was etched into the skyline of London, New York, and Hong Kong. He moved with the effortless grace of a man who had never been told no. His laughter was a resonant, practiced sound, calibrated to project warmth, while keeping everyone at a calculated distance. He leaned in to whisper a joke to a cabinet minister. His cufflink, a single, massive emerald, flashed like a predator's eye. It had started with a simple kit, a plastic tube, a swab of saliva, and a desperate, lingering hope that she belonged somewhere. The results hadn't just given her a family tree, they had handed her a detonator. When the screen flickered to life in her cramped, damp apartment in Peckham, showing a 99.9% match with one of the wealthiest men on the planet, the world had gone silent. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant siren on the street, the drip of the leaky faucet, all vanished. There was only the name Whitmore. Elena watched him from the periphery. She noted the way he adjusted his Taya silk Windsor, not that looked like it cost more than her entire childhood. She smelled the cedarwood and tobacco that followed him like a loyal hound. Every time she approached his table to clear a glass, her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Would he look at her? Would he see the curve of her jaw, the specific shade of amber in her eyes, and recognize the woman he had abandoned 2.5 decades ago? The injustice of it was a bitter stone in her throat. While he was closing billion-dollar mergers, she had been moving from one cold bedroom to another, carrying her life in a single cardboard box. She remembered the sterile smell of the foster agency, a mix of floor wax and disappointment. She remembered the silence of birthdays, where no one called, and here he was, basking in the adoration of the world, unaware that his greatest failure was standing 3 feet away, holding a tray of odd. A guest signaled for another drink. Elena moved through the crowd, her body on autopilot, her mind a whirlwind of memories and calculations. She navigated the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns, her eyes never straying far from Charles. He was talking about legacy now. The word felt like a slap. He spoke of his sons, the heirs to his throne, young men who had been groomed for greatness since their first breath. Elena felt a surge of cold, crystalline anger. What about the legacy he had left in a basket? What about the blood that wasn't wearing a designer suit? Outside, the London rain began to lash against the towering glass windows, blurring the lights of the city into a smear of gold and gray. The storm was coming, both outside and in these walls. Elena took a deep breath, the scent of expensive perfume suddenly making her nauseous. She looked down at her hands. They were steady now. The trembling had been replaced by a resolve as hard as the diamonds around the necks of the women in the room. The architecture of the room was designed to diminish the individual. The gilded moldings, the frescoes of long-dead gods on the ceiling, the sheer scale of the marble columns, all conspired to make one feel small. But Elena didn't feel small anymore. She felt monumental. She was the crack in the foundation. She watched as Charles's wife, a woman of porcelain skin and icy elegance, placed a hand on his arm. The gesture was performative, a display of unity for the cameras that flashed intermittently like heat lightning. "I don't want your money," she whispered to herself, the words lost in the roar of the crowd. "I want you to see me." She imagined the moment of revelation. Would he be ashamed? Or would he simply call security and have her erased again? The uncertainty was a jagged blade, but she leaned into the pain. It was the only thing that felt real in this room of expensive illusions. She passed a table laden with beluga caviar and blinis that looked like miniature works of art. The waste was staggering. The cost of a single bottle of the wine being poured could have fed her for a year. She saw a man drop a napkin, and before it could even hit the floor, another server had replaced it. The efficiency of the service was a testament to the invisibility of people like her. To them, she was furniture, a tool, a shadow. Charles Whitmore stepped onto the small stage at the front of the room. The quartet stopped playing. The room fell into a practiced, respectful silence. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the foyer. He adjusted the microphone. The feedback, a sharp, sudden chirp that made Elena flinch. He began to speak, his voice a rich, authoritative baritone that filled every corner of the vast hall. He spoke of progress. He spoke of the future of the Whitmore Group. He spoke of the sanctity of family values that underpinned every decision he made. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Elena felt the air leave her lungs. She watched his face on the giant LED screens, flanking the stage, every wrinkle of his eyes, every confident smile magnified 100 times. He looked like a king, but she knew the truth of his kingdom. It was built on a lie. It was built on the abandonment of a child who had done nothing but exist. As he finished his speech, the room erupted in applause. It was a deafening, rhythmic thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Elena stood perfectly still, a single point of frozen time in a sea of motion. She looked directly at him, for a fleeting heartbeat of a second. His eyes swept over the crowd and landed on her. There was no recognition, no spark of connection, just the blank, indifferent gaze of a man looking at a shadow. She turned away, her heart a cold, hard coal in her chest. The game had begun. She wasn't just here to watch, she was here to wait, to learn the rhythm of his life, to find the weakness in his armor. Because every empire has a flaw, and every father has a debt to pay. The elevator ascended with a silent, pressurized efficiency. The numbers on the digital display flickering in a rhythmic, neon blue pulse, a countdown to a confrontation that neither of them was truly prepared for. Elena stood at the back of the polished steel car, her reflection distorted in the mirrored surfaces, turning her into a smudge of gray against a backdrop of sterile perfection. The headquarters of the Whitmore Group was a cathedral of glass and steel, perched 70 floors above the Thames, where the air felt thinner and the morality felt even more precarious. She had secured a position as a night shift data analyst, a role that allowed her to drift through the veins of the company like a ghost in the machine, unnoticed, underestimated, and entirely lethal. The silence on the executive floor was not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of secrets. It was a heavy, pressurized quiet that felt as though it might shatter if someone breathed too loudly. Elena stepped onto the plush, charcoal-colored carpet, her footsteps swallowed by the expensive fibers. The scent here was different from the ballroom. It was colder, sharper, a blend of ozone from the server rooms, expensive stationery, and the lingering metallic temps of cold air conditioning. Every corner of this office whispered of Charles's obsession with control. The mahogany desks were cleared of all but the most essential items. The glass partitions were polished to a degree that made them almost invisible, and the lighting was a soft, artificial amber that felt more like a stage than a workplace. She reached her terminal, but her eyes were fixed on the frosted glass of the corner office, the sanctum of the man she had spent a lifetime wondering about. Through the blur of the glass, she could see the silhouette of Charles Whitmore. He was hunched over his desk, the broad shoulders that had looked so invincible at the gala now appearing slumped, burdened by a weight the world couldn't see. The perfect legacy was fraying at the edges. For weeks, Elena had been monitoring the internal ledgers, her eyes scanning millions of lines of code. With a predatory focus, she had found a discrepancy, a slow, methodical bleed of capital, disguised as offshore infrastructure investments, flowing into an account titled Ian Alpha. It wasn't a mistake. It was a betrayal. Her heart began to gallop, a frantic, uneven rhythm that echoed in her ears. Thump-thump. Thump-thumped as she realized the scale of the deception. Julian Vane, Charles's closest confidant, and the man who had stood by him for 30 years, was systematically hollowing out the empire from the inside. He wasn't just stealing money. He was preparing a hostile takeover that would leave Charles not just bankrupt, but criminally liable. Elena felt a strange, cold shiver crawl down her spine. The irony was exquisite. The man who had abandoned her was now being abandoned by the only people he trusted. She leaned into her monitor, the blue light washing over her face, highlighting the sharp lines of her cheekbones and the fierce, unyielding intelligence in her eyes. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, a bridge between her anonymity and her inheritance. She could let it happen. She could sit back in the shadows and watch the Whitmore name be dragged through the mud, watching as the man who never gave her a second thought lost everything he valued. It would be a poetic justice, a silent revenge for the 25 years of cold bedrooms and foster care files. But then she looked at the silhouette again. Charles had picked up a small, silver frame from his desk. He stared at it for a long, agonizing moment of vulnerability so profound it felt like an intrusion to witness it. In that silence, Elena saw something she hadn't expected. She didn't see a titan. She saw an old man. A man who had built a fortress around himself, only to find that he had locked out the very thing he needed most. The anger that had been her fuel for so long suddenly felt heavy, a burden she was tired of carrying. A sudden noise from the hallway made her freeze. The heavy clack of designer heels on the marble foyer echoed through the floor, a sharp, aggressive sound that cut through the silence like a blade. It was Julian Vane's assistant, a woman whose efficiency was matched only by her cruelty. Elena's breath hitched in her throat. If she was caught here, at this terminal, with these files open, there would be no explanation. She would be erased. She moved with a fluid, desperate grace, her fingers flying across the keys to minimize the windows, her mind racing through a dozen different excuses. The footsteps drew closer, clack, clack, clack. The sound was inexorable, a rhythmic heartbeat of impending doom. She could see the shadow of the woman approaching the glass door. Elena ducked her head, pulling her hair forward to shroud her face, pretending to be deep in a routine audit of the shipping manifests. The door slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. The air in the room seemed to drop 5 degrees. Elena didn't look up. She kept her eyes fixed on the rows of meaningless numbers, her peripheral vision catching the sharp red hem of the assistant's skirt. The woman paused, her gaze sweeping over the near-empty office. The silence stretched, becoming a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of tension that made Elena's lungs burn. "Late night, isn't it?" The assistant's voice was like ice cracking, thin, sharp, and entirely devoid of warmth. Elena forced her voice to remain steady, though her pulse was a drumbeat in her throat. "The quarter-end reports don't write themselves," she replied, her tone a perfect imitation of a weary, mid-level employee. The assistant hummed, a low, skeptical sound that vibrated in the air. She lingered for a moment longer, the longest 10 seconds of Elena's life before turning and walking toward the executive suite. Elena let out a long, shuddering breath, her forehead leaning against the cool plastic of the monitor. The close call had left her skin buzzing with adrenaline. The stakes had shifted. This wasn't just about a secret anymore. It was about a survival that had become inextricably linked to the man she was supposed to hate. She returned to the files. The data was a labyrinth, a complex web of shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg. But Elena had been navigating labyrinths her entire life. She saw the patterns Vane had tried to hide, the small, incremental transfers, the forged signatures of the board members, the digital footprints left in the dark corners of the server. She realized then that she held the only key that could stop the collapse. She had the evidence that would clear Charles and expose the traitors. She sat back, the hum of the city. Outside the window, a distant, muffled roar. The skyscrapers of London looked like jagged glass teeth, reaching for the stars. Somewhere out there, the world was sleeping, unaware that the fate of $1 billion legacy was resting in the hands of a girl who had once been nothing more than a number in a government database. The mystery of her father's life was no longer a mystery. It was a tragedy in 3 acts, and she was the only one who could write the ending. But to save him, she would have to step out of the shadows. She would have to confront the ghost of the man who had discarded her and show him that his greatest asset was untouchable his buildings. Or his name, it was the resilience he had inadvertently forged in the daughter he never knew. The suspense of the coming days felt like a tightening wire. Every move she made from this point forward would be a gamble. Every document she copied, every secret she unearthed, was a step toward a confrontation that would either destroy her or finally, after a lifetime of searching, set her free. As the first hint of gray dawn began to bleed into the London sky, Elena closed the last file. She looked at the office of Charles Whitmore one last time. He was still there, a lonely figure in a room full of shadows. She knew what she had to do. The bridge was built. Now, she just had to find the courage to cross it. The door to the inner sanctum didn't creak. It moved with a silent, oiled precision that felt more like a judgment than a mechanical process. Elena stood on the threshold, her hand still resting on the heavy brass handle, the coldness of the metal seeping through her skin and into the marrow of her bones. The room was bathed in the bruised purple light of a London twilight, the city's neon veins pulsing far below like a distant, electrified heartbeat. Charles Whitmore did not look up immediately. He was a statue carved from grief and ink, surrounded by the ruins of his digital kingdom. The smell in the room was suffocatingly masculine, expensive leather, the sharp acidity of black coffee, and the lingering, ghostly scent of old books that had never been read. "I don't recall requesting an audit at this hour," he said, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like sandpaper on silk. He finally lifted his head, and for the first time, Elena saw the true cost of his empire. The man was a hollow shell. His eyes, usually sharp enough to cut glass, were clouded with a realization that the walls were closing in. Elena didn't speak. She walked toward the desk, her footsteps making no sound on the deep, charcoal-colored carpet. Every inch of that walk felt like a mile. Every second was stretched into an eternity of sensory overload. She noticed the way a single dust mote danced in the beam of his desk lamp, tiny chaotic universe, swirling in a sea of static. She noticed the slight tremor in his right hand, the one he used to sign the destinies of thousands. She placed the manila folder on the polished mahogany surface. The sound of the paper hitting the wood was a sharp, final report, a gunshot in a library. Charles looked at the folder, then at her. "What is this?" he asked, his tone hovering somewhere between irritation and a burgeoning instinctual fear. Elena leaned forward, the light of the lamp catching the amber in her eyes, a mirror image of his own. "This is the Ian Alpha file, Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice a calm, steady anchor in the storm. "It contains the digital signatures of Julian Vane, the transaction codes for the Cayman accounts, and the proof that by tomorrow morning your name will be nothing but a footnote in a bankruptcy filing." The silence that followed was not empty. It was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that seemed to squeeze the air from the room. Charles reached for the folder, his movements slow and agonizingly deliberate. He opened it, and Elena watched as his world dismantled itself in real time. His eyes darted across the lines of data betrayals, the numbers, the cold, hard facts of his ruin. The clock on the wall ticked, a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat that felt like a countdown. 5 seconds of reading became an age of silent horror. His face paled, the skin tightening over his cheekbones, until he looked like a death mask of the man he used to be. "Why," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ventilation, "why are you giving this to me?" He wasn't asking about Julian anymore. He was asking about Hertha girl from the night shift who had just handed him his life back on a silver platter of evidence. Elena reached into the pocket of her vest and pulled out a smaller, square envelope. This was the moment she had rehearsed in the quiet corners of foster homes and the sterile halls of libraries. She slid the envelope across the desk. It was white, unassuming, and held the weight of 25 years of unanswered questions. Charles took it, his fingers fumbling with the seal. He pulled out the DNA results. The 99.9% match glared back at him in bold black ink. He looked at the paper. He looked at her. He looked back at the paper. The realization hit him like a physical blow, his breath hitching in a jagged, painful gasp, a sound of a man drowning in his own history. "Felina," he breathed, the name tasting like ash and iron on his tongue. He had known about the child. He had known about the woman he left in a small town with nothing but a promise he never intended to keep. But he had convinced himself she didn't exist. He had buried her under layers of gold and glass, until the lie became his truth. And now the lie was standing in front of him, saving his life. He moved to stand, to perhaps reach out, but Elena stepped back, a sharp, sudden movement that re-established the chasm between them. "I didn't do this for you," she said, her words cold and precise, like diamonds being dropped onto a glass table. "I didn't do this to become a Whitmore. I did this because I spent my entire life wondering what kind of man could walk away from his own blood. I needed to see you, not as a titan, not as a billionaire, but as the man who was so blinded by his own shadow that he could unsee the light he was throwing away." Charles looked at the evidence of his betrayal and the evidence of his fatherhood. He saw the empire he had nearly lost, and the daughter he had already lost. The irony was a bitter, jagged pill. He had spent his life building a legacy, only to realize that the only part of him worth saving was the part he had tried to erase. "I can make this right," he said, desperation beginning to bleed into his voice. "The shares, the trust. You're my daughter, Elena. Everything I have, everything you have, is built on a foundation of absence." She interrupted, her voice softening, but losing none of its edge. "You think you can buy a daughter. You think you can replace 25 years of silence with a bank account." She looked around the opulent office, at the original Picassos on the walls, and the view of a city that bowed to his name. "Keep your money, Charles. Keep your company. I've lived my life without your help, and I've built a soul you couldn't afford on your best day. I gave you that folder because I refused to let a snake like Julian Vane win, and because I wanted you to know exactly what you lost." She turned and walked toward the door, her silhouette framed by the fading light of the London sky. Behind her, Charles Whitmore sat in the ruins of his pride. He was a billionaire again, his wealth secured, his enemies defeated. But as he watched the door click shut behind the only person who truly knew him, he had never felt more bankrupt. The silence of the office returned, heavier than before, a suffocating shroud of velvet and regret. The elevator descent was different this time. The numbers flickered in the neon blue pulse, but Elena didn't look at her reflection. She watched the city rise to meet Hertha, real world, the world of rain and struggle and beautiful, messy truth. She stepped out into the cool London air, the scent of petrichor and exhaust filling her lungs like a benediction. The rain had stopped. The clouds were partying, revealing a sliver of a silver moon that hung over the Thames like a hook. Blood creates life, a biological necessity that binds us to the past. But responsibility, love, those are the things we choose. Elena walked into the crowd, her footsteps steady and her heart finally quiet. She wasn't a Whitmore. She was something far more powerful. She was herself. Behind her, the tower of glass and steel glowed like a beacon, a monument to a man who had everything and understood nothing. As she disappeared into the shadows of the city, she didn't look back. The legacy was finished. The story was finally hers.